Welcome back to My Mind MashUps. We've got another deep dive for you today.
That's right. We're digging into a topic based on a whole bunch of sources you shared with us.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating one. We're talking about the idea of a mass awakening.
It's a term you hear popping up quite a bit, right? Social media, even some academic stuff.
Exactly. So our mission today is basically to navigate all these sources
Pull out the juicy bits, the interesting insights.
and help you, our listener, kind of get a handle on the different perspectives and evidence around this whole cultural phenomenon.
Without feeling overwhelmed, hopefully. We'll look at how different groups define it, what evidence people point to.
Even touch on some science and psychology angles.
Yeah, think of it as your shortcut to being clued in on the mass awakening.
Mm.
Maybe with a few surprises along the way.
All right, let's get started. So this term, mass awakening, what exactly are we talking about here? Seems like it could mean different things.
That's definitely the first thing to grasp. It generally points to this idea of a collective shift in consciousness happening worldwide.
Okay, a global shift.
But yet, how people interpret that shift, that varies a lot.
So give us the breakdown. What are the main flavors of this mass awakening idea?
Okay, well, in some spiritual circles, it's seen very specifically. They often link it to things like the age of Aquarius starting.
Ah, I've heard that phrase.
Right. And this concept of Christ consciousness emerging. For them, it's often about dismantling what they see as systems of oppression.
To create what? A better world.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
They often call it the new earth.
Interesting. So that's one angle. What else?
Then you've got views that are maybe less tied to specific prophecies and more about, like, personal liberation.
Liberation from what?
From social conditioning, mostly. The idea is we're kind of awakening to the matrix, seeing how cultural norms shape us without us realizing.
Like becoming aware of the invisible rules we live by.
Exactly. And some sources even describe that conditioning as the most pervasive form of trauma on the planet. Pretty strong words.
Wow, yeah. That's quite a statement.
It is. But a common thread across many of these views is this idea of seeing through illusions.
Okay, peeling back layers.
Kind of. Recognizing maybe where we've been led astray or where we've suppressed our own authentic needs and desires.
That makes sense. Is there anyone who's tried to summarize this idea?
Well, Anne-Marie Marin, in a blog post from 2025, she talks about it as a pivotal threshold, like we're at a tipping point.
A tipping point. Leading where?
She suggests that if enough people cross this threshold into a new awareness, it could unlock, and I'm quoting here, wildly unimaginable miracles, a real shift in reality.
Okay, that's a big idea. A collective shift changing reality itself.
It is. And tied into all this, something else pops up frequently in the sources.
What's that?
This shift away from organized religion towards more personal spirituality.
Ah, right. We see that talked about a lot these days, don't we?
Definitely. The data backs it up too. Pew Research in 2023 found 70% of U.S. adults say they're spiritual.
70%.
Yeah. And get this, 22% of those identify as spiritual but not religious.
So a significant chunk are finding spirituality outside traditional church doors, basically.
Seems like it. And another Pew finding 41% of Americans say they become more spiritual over their lifetime.
Compared to how many becoming more religious?
Only 24%. So there's a definite trend there. People are evolving spiritually, but maybe not necessarily within traditional religious frameworks.
Okay, so we've got the concept defined, this link to the spirituality versus religion trend. But what about hard evidence? Is there anything concrete suggesting this awakening is actually happening on a wider scale?
Well, hard evidence is tricky with consciousness, right? But there are studies with quantitative data that seem to align with these ideas.
Like what?
One area is the prevalence of what researchers call spiritually transformative experiences, STEs for short.
STEs sounds intense. What qualifies as an STE?
Scientifically, they define it as a kind of mystical experience. It often involves feelings of, like, expansion. Maybe your awareness feels like it's leaving your body.
Whoa.
Yeah, or feeling energy, like rising up your spine, being enveloped in light or love, or feeling deeply connected to everything, like a unified energy field.
Okay, and are these common?
Surprisingly so, maybe. Yeah. Depending on the study, somewhere between 34% and 41% of people report having had an experience like that.
That's quite a few people, a third to almost half.
Exactly. And other surveys back this up. That 2023 Pew study again, 45% of Americans reported a sudden feeling of connection with something beyond this world.
A connection to something bigger.
Right. And 38% felt they'd received communication from someone who'd passed away. And 30% said they'd personally encountered a spirit or some kind of unseen spiritual force.
So these aren't just fringe experiences. They're reported by a decent chunk of the population.
That's what the numbers suggest. And it's not just a U.S. thing. An Ipsos Global Religion Survey in 2023, across 26 countries, found that 61% overall believe in either God or some kind of higher power or spirit.
61% globally.
Yeah. Now, 40% believe in God, as described in scriptures, but another 20% believed in a more general higher spirit or power.
So belief in something beyond the material is the majority view globally based on that survey.
Pretty much. Though the survey also noted some big differences between generations, like Gen Z and Boomers, so it's evolving.
Right. And is the interest in this stuff growing? Like, are more people searching for spiritual awakening?
Looks like it. Google Trends data shows pretty consistent growth in searches for that term, which lines up with that Pew finding that 41% of Americans feel they've become more spiritual over time. It suggests an active seeking, not just a static belief.
Okay, so we've got definitions, the spirituality shift, data on experiences and interest. How is this all playing out in, like, public discussion? Are academics looking at this?
It's definitely being discussed more broadly. You've got people like Dr. Martha Beck, the Harvard sociologist.
Right, you mentioned her earlier.
Yeah, she applies sociological models to this idea of a global paradigm shift. She talks about a kind of threshold. Like, if 25–30% of people adopt a new way, it starts to starve the opposing view of energy.
Interesting, like a social tipping point.
Exactly. And she uses this term extinction bursts.
Extinction bursts.
Yeah, suggesting that maybe the intense conflict we see globally now is like the last desperate roar of a dying paradigm.
Wow. That's one way to frame current events, I suppose.
It's a sociological take, yeah. And it's not just academics. Mainstream news outlets like the New York Times, CBS News, they've run stories on rising spirituality and declining religion.
So it's definitely hitting the mainstream radar.
For sure. CBS News in 2023 cited a Gallup poll. 82% of Americans have some kind of spiritual belief system. 82. Even as organized religion declines.
That's huge.
It is. And in that same report, Lisa Miller, a clinical psychologist from Columbia, she pointed to like 20 years of peer-reviewed science showing humans are basically hardwired for spirituality.
Yeah.
And that strengthening that core actually leads to better health, more resilience.
So it's not just belief, it's potentially fundamental to our well-being.
That's the argument, yeah.
Yeah.
Backed by research, according to her.
Fascinating. Okay, let's pivot a bit. What about the psychology of it all? On an individual level, what might be going on?
Yeah, this is where it gets really personal. Research by Steve Taylor looked into what triggers these awakenings in individuals.
And what did he find? What kicks it off for people?
Well, the biggest one, maybe surprisingly, was psychological turmoil, like depression, trauma. That accounted for about 23.6% of cases.
So hitting rock bottom can sometimes lead to looking up?
Seems that way for quite a few people. Other triggers were experiences in nature, about 18%, meditation, about 13%, even attending arts performances, also 13%.
Interesting mix. It suggests intense experiences, whether difficult or beautiful, can be catalysts.
Right. Which does make you wonder, as you said, about collective trauma or stress. Could that fuel a mass awakening? It's a compelling thought.
Yeah, it really is. And are there, like, stages people go through? Is it a process?
Definitely described as a process in many sources, not usually a sudden flip of a switch.
Okay.
One source we looked at even mapped out 19 potential stages.
19? Like what?
Well, it starts with things like the hope for meaning, then maybe the catalyst, which they dramatically call the big airy breakdown.
Ah, okay.
Then moving into things like the bizarre interests, suddenly getting into tarot or energy healing, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
And even physical symptoms plus emotional waves as your whole system is recalibrating, essentially.
It sounds like a bit of an upheaval, potentially.
It can be, yeah. It's often described as disorienting, but ultimately leading to a more authentic state.
Okay, so that's the psychological angle. Now, what about the more, let's say, spiritual interpretations? We touched on Age of Aquarius. What else comes up?
Right, there are several distinct concepts within the spiritual communities discussing this. One big one is 5D consciousness.
5D, as in 5 dimensions.
Sort of. It's usually framed as a shift from our current perceived 3D reality, which is seen as materialistic, ego-driven, based on separation, to a 5D existence. This is described as being more about unity, love, seeing interconnectedness intuitively. Less analytical, more heart-centered.
So a different way of perceiving reality itself.
Exactly. Yeah, it's often linked directly to this Age of Aquarius idea.
How so?
The Age of Aquarius is seen as an astrological era focused on innovation, sharing information, spiritual enlightenment, collective progress.
I see the connection.
Some even point to things like social media as an Aquarian way of sharing knowledge, despite its downsides.
Interesting take. Are there criticisms of this 5D idea?
Oh yeah, some critics warn it can sound a bit elitist, like only certain evolved people get to 5D, kind of like echoes of the Christian rapture idea, but in a New Age context.
Right, potential for spiritual hierarchies. Okay, what other spiritual concepts tie in?
Kundalini awakening is another one you hear about a lot.
Kundalini. That's the energy at the base of the spine, right? From yoga tradition.
That's the one. It's described as this dormant, powerful energy that, when awakened, ascends up the spine.
And what happens then?
It's said to lead to expanded consciousness, sometimes physical sensations like tingling or heat, emotional releases, heightened intuition, a whole range of experiences.
Okay. And how does that relate to a mass awakening?
The theory some propose is that if this Kundalini energy activates on a mass scale, it could help dissolve collective fear and foster more empathy and unity.
A collective energy shift. And what might trigger these awakenings?
Similar things to the general triggers we discussed: trauma, deep meditation, but also potentially global crises, acting as a collective catalyst. Spontaneous awakenings are reported too.
Are there risks? It sounds quite powerful.
There are warnings, yes, especially with unguided or unexpected awakenings. There's something called Kundalini syndrome, which can involve symptoms resembling psychosis, intense physical discomfort. It's generally advised to approach Kundalini practices with guidance.
Good to know. Okay, 5D, Kundalini. Anything else prominent?
The pineal gland gets a lot of attention.
Ah, the third eye.
Exactly. Revered in many traditions as the seat of intuition, spiritual vision.
And what's the connection to mass awakening?
Well, biologically, it produces melatonin, regulates rhythms, but metaphysically, it's linked to insight, seeing beyond the veil, that kind of thing.
Right, like in ancient Egypt or the Hindu concept of the Ajna chakra.
Precisely. The idea is that if this third eye becomes more active collectively, perhaps through practices aimed at decalcification.
Decalcification, like getting rid of fluoride buildup.
That's often part of the discussion, yeah. Along with things like meditation, specific diets. The goal is supposedly to enhance collective intuition and perception.
And maybe the introspection during the pandemic, plus all the digital connection, accelerated this.
That's a theory some propose, yeah. More time for inner work, more exposure to these ideas online.
Okay, one more. I've heard people talk about DNA upgrades. What's that about? Sounds very sci-fi.
It does. This idea posits that humans actually have latent potential for like 12-stranded DNA, not just the double helix we know.
12 strands. And what would that do?
Supposedly, activating these extra strands unlocks higher dimensional abilities, deeper connection to ancestral wisdom, that sort of thing.
And how does this activation happen?
It's often linked to cosmic events or timelines. For instance, the end of the Mayan long count calendar in 2012.
Ah, 2012. That was supposed to be the end of the world, wasn't it?
Well, some interpretations saw it less as an apocalypse and more as the start of a new cycle, a shift into conscious co-creation.
Okay.
And the idea is that this transition period triggers these light codes in our DNA, helping us process old trauma and embody a more crystalline form. Less dense, more light.
Crystalline bodies.
Right.
And evidence for this.
Proponents often point to things like increased synchronicities, psychic phenomena becoming more common as signs that this DNA upgrade is underway. Very much in the realm of spiritual belief, obviously.
Got it. And you mentioned ancient prophecies, Mayan calendar, Age of Aquarius. These seem to weave through many of these interpretations.
They really do. The Mayan calendar end date is often seen as opening a portal, not an endpoint, leading towards unity consciousness.
A transition, not a termination.
Exactly. And the shift from the Age of Pisces, seen as more dogmatic, hierarchical, to Aquarius, more egalitarian, tech-focused, innovative, lines up with many of these narratives about breaking free from old structures.
And aligns with the 5D ideas of instant manifestation, telepathy.
Yeah, those are often considered potential abilities associated with these higher states of consciousness predicted by these prophecies. It all ties together in these frameworks.
Okay, that covers a lot of the spiritual interpretations. Let's shift gears now. What about more mainstream science and psychology? How do they view these phenomena or things related to them?
Well, mainstream science doesn't directly validate things like 12-strand DNA, or 5D, obviously. But it does offer insights into mechanisms that could underlie some aspects of awakening experiences. Neuroplasticity is a big one.
Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change itself, right?
Exactly. We know the brain can reorganize its neural pathways based on experience, thoughts, and practices.
How does that relate to awakening?
Well, practices often associated with spiritual growth, like meditation and mindfulness. Studies show they can physically change the brain.
Like how?
Increased gray matter in areas like the prefrontal cortex, involved in planning, decision-making, self-awareness, and the hippocampus, which is key for learning, memory, and emotional regulation.
So meditation literally builds up parts of the brain related to higher function and calm.
Seems so. Long-term meditators show thicker cortical regions linked to attention and interoceptive awareness. That's awareness of your internal body state.
Okay.
Some researchers, like Kurt Thompson, talk about how intentional practices create new neural associations, helping us shift from, say, fear-based reactions to more empathy and connection.
Rewiring ourselves for the better, essentially.
That's the idea. Even ancient practices like Sankalpa, setting intentions in Yoga Nidra, are being looked at for how they might enhance this neuroplasticity, anchoring new patterns and reducing the dominance of the default mode network.
The DMN, that's the part involved in mind-wandering self-thought, right?
Yeah, the brain's baseline chatter. And trauma also plays a role here. Trauma disrupts brain circuits, which can be incredibly difficult, but
Might also create an opening.
potentially. The concept of post-traumatic growth is well documented, sometimes involving strengthened connections between the amygdala, fear center, and the prefrontal cortex, regulation center.
Interesting. What about psychology beyond neuroplasticity? Any relevant theories?
Carl Jung's work is often brought up. His idea of individuation.
Individuation, becoming a whole integrated self.
Exactly. Reconciling the conscious and unconscious parts of the psyche. It mirrors the awakening process, quite closely integrating the shadow aspects, the parts of ourselves we deny or repress.
Especially relevant for trauma survivors, I imagine.
Very much so. Confronting the shadow is seen as essential for wholeness in Jungian thought. And Jung didn't just see this as personal.
How so?
He believed individuation connects us to the objective psyche, a transpersonal realm containing universal archetypes. Think about near-death experiences. NDEs, people often report encountering archetypal figures or landscapes.
Light beings, tunnels, life reviews.
Right. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, this shared innate reservoir of human experience expressed through universal symbols and myths, helps explain why these motifs appear across cultures and in mystical experiences.
So visions during meditation or psychedelic experiences like seeing mandalas, Jung might say that's the collective unconscious bubbling up.
That's one interpretation, yeah. Perhaps linked to changes in brain activity, like in the DMN or limbic system, allowing these archetypal patterns to surface.
You mentioned trauma earlier as a trigger. Can we explore that connection a bit more from a scientific angle?
Sure. Trauma can significantly disrupt the default mode network, that self-referential chatter.
And quieting the DMN that's linked to mystical states.
It seems to be. Reduced DMN activities observed during various spiritually transformative experiences, like NDEs or deep meditation. It correlates with feelings of unity, transcendence, loss of self.
Like the brain's usual filter on reality is temporarily lessened.
That's one hypothesis, sometimes called the filter hypothesis, proposed by researchers like Marjorie Woollacott. The idea is the brain normally filters out a lot of information, and trauma or certain practices might temporarily reduce that filtering.
And we know statistically, psychological distress often precedes awakening.
Right, that 23.6% figure from Steve Taylor's research. Think of someone like Eckhart Tolle. His profound awakening happened during a period of intense suicidal depression. He describes suddenly shifting into a state of formless awareness.
So the breakdown can sometimes lead to a breakthrough.
It appears so for some individuals. And another area science is looking at closely now is psychedelics.
Ah, right. The psychedelic renaissance. How does that fit in?
Well, psychedelics like psilocybin or LSD are known to induce states that often overlap with mystical or spiritual experiences.
How do they do that in the brain?
They also tend to suppress the default mode network. But interestingly, they seem to increase global brain connectivity, different brain regions communicating more freely with each other.
So less ego chatter, more interconnected thinking.
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
Studies are even showing physical changes. A 2025 study on psilocin found it increased dendritic complexity, basically, more connections between neurons.
Yeah.
Synaptogenesis.
Wow, actually building new connections.
Yeah. And the subjective effects are powerful. Roland Griffiths' research at Johns Hopkins found that a high percentage, around 70%, rated their psilocybin experience as one of the most spiritually significant events of their lives.
More significant than births or deaths.
For many, yes. And these experiences often led to lasting positive changes, like reduced anxiety and decreased materialism.
What about other substances like MDMA?
MDMA is being studied extensively for trauma therapy, particularly PTSD.
Yeah.
It seems to reduce hyperactivity in the amygdala.
The fear center again.
Right. And it strengthens connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus areas involved in processing and contextualizing memories.
So helping people reprocess trauma without being overwhelmed by fear.
That's the goal. Studies with veterans have shown reduced activation in brain areas associated with threat perception during trauma recall after MDMA therapy.
And MDMA is known for its empathogenic effects, right? Feeling connected to others.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which, from a Jungian perspective, could facilitate integrating those shadow aspects by fostering self-compassion and connection, rather than fear or judgment.
Okay, this is fascinating. So science is exploring brain changes, psychological processes, even the effects of psychedelics that seem to touch on aspects of these awakening experiences. But what about the role of the internet in all this? Particularly social media. It feels like these ideas are everywhere online now.
Oh, absolutely. The rise of online spirituality, especially on platforms like TikTok and Instagram, is a huge factor in how these ideas are spreading.
How does that work? Is it just accessibility?
Accessibility is part of it, but it's also the algorithms. Social media algorithms are designed to maximize engagement, right?
Yeah, keep you scrolling.
So they rapidly amplify content that gets reactions. Spiritual content, especially stuff that's visually appealing or emotionally resonant, can spread incredibly fast through For You pages and recommendations.
So if you show a little interest, you suddenly get flooded with it.
Pretty much. You have creators on TikTok, for example, blending spiritual teachings with relatable humor or aesthetics, attracting millions of viewers. It lowers the barrier to entry, both for consuming and creating this content.
Meaning anyone can become a guru online?
That's one of the potential downsides, yeah. Less vetting, more focus on popularity.
And did the pandemic play a role in this online surge?
Hugely. The uncertainty, the isolation, the existential questions.
Yeah.
It drove a lot of people online seeking answers, solace, connection.
And they found spiritual content waiting for them.
Exactly. Hashtags like #SpiritualAwakening exploded on TikTok, billions of views. Influencers often position themselves as guides through the crisis.
And there's money to be made, I assume.
Oh, definitely. Spiritual content can be very lucrative. Ads, sponsorships, selling courses, readings, products.
Which creates an incentive to be popular, maybe over being accurate or responsible.
That's the risk, prioritizing virality over substance. Some accounts use tactics that border on fear-mongering, clear negative energy by buying their service, that kind of thing.
Right. But are there positive sides to online spirituality?
For sure. One is the democratization of knowledge. You can access teachings from diverse traditions, Native American spirituality, Hindu practices right on your phone.
Things you might never encounter otherwise.
Exactly. And virtual education can genuinely enhance well-being. Some studies show online spiritual resources improve spiritual health for participants.
What about community? Can you find that online?
Yes, that's another big positive. People from marginalized groups, LGBTQ+ folks, trauma survivors, often find community and affirmation in online spaces, like #WitchTalk or #SpiritualTikTok when they might feel isolated offline.
Sharing rituals, coping strategies.
Yeah, finding people who get it. And it normalizes practices that used to be more niche, tarot, crystals, breathwork. They're entering the mainstream conversation, partly thanks to influencers making them seem accessible, even empowering.
Like manifestation framed as self-help.
Right. Simplifying complex ideas, for better or worse.
Okay, so accessibility, community, normalization. But what are the big downsides or risks? You mentioned misinformation.
Yeah, that's a major one. Pseudoscience spreads easily. Claims about DNA upgrades, mandatory pineal decalcification, often presented as fact without evidence.
And that can be harmful.
It can divert people from evidence-based healthcare, for one. And then there's spiritual bypassing.
Spiritual bypassing. Using spiritual ideas to avoid dealing with difficult stuff.
Exactly. Toxic positivity, like just manifest forgiveness for serious abuse, or framing systemic issues like poverty as just a soul lesson, it trivializes real problems and pain.
That sounds potentially damaging. What else?
Algorithmic rabbit holes are a concern. The same algorithms that connect people can also create echo chambers, feeding users increasingly extreme or niche content.
Like getting stuck in a loop of conspiracy theories mixed with spirituality.
That's a known phenomenon, sometimes called conspirituality. And constant exposure to either relentless toxic positivity or, conversely, apocalyptic prophecies can really mess with mental health, increasing anxiety, dissociation. There's research on this.
And outright exploitation. Scams.
Sadly, yes. Fraudulent healers charging huge sums for questionable services. Even algorithms promoting genuinely harmful content masked as spirituality sometimes. It requires critical thinking from the user.
Which brings us back to algorithms. How much are they shaping this whole thing?
Quite a bit. There's this interesting idea of algorithmic conspirituality, where users start interpreting the algorithm's recommendations as meaningful, like the universe sending them signs through their feed.
Wow, blurring the lines between technology and mysticism.
Exactly. Research suggests a significant number of TikTok users experience this, and algorithms tend to amplify polarizing narratives because they get engagement like extreme takes on 5D ascension or climate change being karma. It can skew perception towards the sensational.
Okay, so the online space is really complex, both a source of connection and knowledge, but also rife with potential pitfalls. Now, with all this talk of awakening, spirituality, brain changes, there must be skeptical perspectives too, right? Alternate explanations.
Well, absolutely. A major point of critique comes from mainstream psychology and psychiatry regarding potential misdiagnosis
Misdiagnosis of what?
of mental health crises. Transpersonal psychology talks about spiritual emergencies, intense, disorienting experiences that can be part of growth, but the symptoms can look very similar to serious psychiatric disorders.
Like psychosis, schizophrenia.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Sudden awakenings, especially Kundalini experiences sometimes, can involve altered perceptions, hearing voices, unusual beliefs, things that overlap significantly with symptoms of psychosis or dissociation.
And we know psychological turmoil often precedes these experiences.
Right, that 23.6% figure again. So distinguishing between a spiritual crisis that needs support versus a psychiatric condition needing urgent medical treatment can be really difficult.
And people might self-diagnose an awakening online when they actually need professional help.
That's a serious risk. Looking at online forums, you see people describing experiences that sound very much like clinical dissociation, PTSD, or even psychosis, but interpreting them solely through a signs of awakening lens. Delaying proper care can be dangerous.
Okay, that's a crucial point. What other skeptical takes are there?
Some critics frame the whole mass awakening narrative as potentially a form of mass delusion or even societal psychosis.
Mass delusion, like a shared fantasy.
Kind of. Drawing on ideas like Matthias Desmet's mass formation psychosis, the argument is that during times of high anxiety and social disconnection, like a pandemic or economic instability,
Which we've certainly had.
right, people become more susceptible to shared narratives or belief systems that offer meaning and connection, even if those beliefs are detached from reality. It's seen as a collective coping mechanism.
So the surge in awakening content during COVID could be seen as a symptom of collective anxiety, rather than genuine spiritual uplift.
That's the argument. Comparing it, in a way, to historical mass delusions, like witch hunts, fueled by fear and uncertainty. And the algorithms feeding us similar content might create the illusion of a unified shift.
Right, the algorithmic echo chamber making it seem bigger than it is.
Exactly. Another major critique is just the lack of empirical rigor and the prevalence of pseudoscience.
We've touched on this with the online stuff.
Yeah. Mainstream psychology often critiques transpersonal psychology for relying too heavily on subjective experience and metaphysical claims that aren't easily testable.
Like 5D consciousness or DNA upgrades.
Precisely. These are often dismissed as pseudoscience lacking peer-reviewed evidence. Claims about the pineal gland or Kundalini are often based on anecdote rather than controlled studies.
And commercialization makes it worse.
It can, yeah. Influencers monetizing unverified practices fuels the spread of questionable information. Some critics argue the whole narrative might stem more from individual dissatisfaction and egoic projection, wanting to feel special or chosen, than any genuine collective shift.
The illusion of collective spiritual awakening, as one source put it.
Right. Then there's the critique of spiritual bypassing again, but on a larger scale.
Using spirituality to avoid societal problems.
Yeah. If you frame climate change as just planetary karma or poverty as simply a soul's choice, it can divert energy from seeking practical, systemic solutions.
Focusing on personal enlightenment while ignoring collective action.
That's the concern. John Wellwood, who coined spiritual bypassing, talked about using spiritual practices as a defense against emotional pain. Critics argue a focus on individual awakening can neglect the need to confront societal shadows, not just personal ones. True individuation, some argue, requires engaging with the world's problems too.
Makes sense. Any other alternate theories?
One more related point is seeing the rise in spirituality simply as a predictable trauma response to societal stress.
Like after 9/11 or during COVID.
Exactly. Historically, major crises often correlate with increases in religiosity or spirituality. People seek meaning, comfort, and frameworks to understand suffering during uncertain times.
So, interpreting personal distress through a spiritual awakening lens might just be a way of coping.
That's the idea. And it might risk pathologizing normal stress responses by labeling them as something mystical. Interestingly, during lockdowns, many churchgoers reported heightened spiritual awareness, but fewer felt closer to their communities, suggesting maybe isolation was a key driver for seeking that individual connection.
Okay, so lots of critical perspectives to consider too. Misdiagnosis, potential delusion, pseudoscience, bypassing, trauma responses. It adds important layers of caution.
Definitely, it highlights the need for discernment.
Right. So given all this complexity, the potential for profound experience, but also the risks of delusion or bypassing, if someone feels they're going through some kind of personal awakening process, what helps them stay grounded? What practical advice is out there?
That's a great question. Several practical tools come up repeatedly in the sources for navigating these intense experiences.
Well,
Journaling is a big one.
just writing things down, how does that help?
It helps organize thoughts, process emotions, reframe narratives. Studies show it can reduce anxiety and depression symptoms. It fosters self-awareness by letting you track patterns, insights, shifts over time.
Like an external hard drive for your inner world?
Kind of. Even just 15 minutes a day has been shown to lower cortisol levels. The key is consistency and doing it without judgment, just documenting your experience. Using prompts can help too, focusing on fears, values, gratitudes.
Okay, journaling. What else?
Mindfulness. We talked about how it can physically change the brain.
Rewiring for resilience.
Exactly. It helps enhance emotional regulation and reduces that DMN rumination. When things feel overwhelming or hypersensitive, which can happen during awakenings, mindfulness acts as a mental anchor.
How? Like focusing on the breath.
Breath is a classic anchor, but also simple grounding techniques like the 5-4-3-2-1 method, naming things you can see, hear, feel, smell, taste, can interrupt spiraling thoughts.
Brings you back to the present moment.
Right. Mindful movement, like walking or yoga, also helps by lowering stress hormones. Even just mindfully eating or focusing on tactile sensations can anchor the nervous system. Guided meditations, like apps such as Insight Timer offer, can be really helpful too, especially for anxiety or dissociation.
Good tips. What about getting outside? You mentioned nature as a trigger earlier.
Yes, nature exposure or ecotherapy is highly recommended. Spending time in nature is consistently shown to reduce stress hormones like cortisol, boost mood regulators like serotonin, and alleviate depression.
Just being outdoors helps that much.
Apparently so. Even short walks, like 20 minutes, can enhance cognitive function and emotional regulation, especially during challenging transitions. A 2022 meta-analysis backed this up.
Does virtual nature count?
It seems to have some positive effect, but being physically in nature is generally better. Activities like gardening combine physical movement with sensory input and a sense of agency.
Getting your hands dirty, literally grounding.
Exactly. And doing mindfulness while in nature can amplify the calming effects. Green exercise, like hiking or cycling, gives you endorphins, plus that connection.
Okay, nature connection. What about human connection? Community.
Crucial. Going through potentially disorienting transformations can feel incredibly isolating. Connecting with others who have similar experiences reduces stigma and validates what you're going through.
Finding your tribe, so to speak.
Yeah. Peer support groups have been shown to significantly reduce feelings of alienation. Some studies on trauma-informed ecotherapy groups showed participants had notably higher resilience scores.
Where do people find these communities?
It could be local support circles, maybe therapeutic groups, or even online communities, though. As we discussed, caution and discernment are needed with online sources. But finding safe spaces to share is key.
Makes sense. Any other grounding techniques specifically for when things feel really intense?
Yes, specific grounding techniques aim to interrupt panic or dissociation by engaging the senses directly.
Like the 5-4-3-2-1 you mentioned.
Right. That activates the prefrontal cortex, bringing the thinking brain back online. Other simple things work too, pressing your feet firmly into the floor, holding a cold object. These can stimulate the vagus nerve, which helps slow heart rate.
Physical anchors.
Exactly. Controlled breathing techniques like box breathing, inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4, directly regulate the autonomic nervous system. Progressive muscle relaxation helps release physical tension. Even scent therapy, like smelling lavender, can trigger calming parasympathetic responses.
Lots of practical tools people can use.
Definitely. The emphasis is on balancing the inner exploration with practices that keep you anchored in your body in the present moment.
That seems like really valuable advice for anyone navigating intense change, regardless of how they label it.
I think so too. It's about self-care and managing the nervous system through the process.
Well, this has been quite a journey through the concept of mass awakening. We've covered a lot of ground.
We really have. From the spiritual ideas like 5D and Kundalini to the psychological angles like Jung and trauma, the scientific research on neuroplasticity and psychedelics.
Not to mention the whole online spirituality phenomenon and the important skeptical counterpoints.
It's clear this touches on some really profound questions, doesn't it? About consciousness, where society might be heading, our personal search for meaning.
Absolutely. And whether you lean towards the spiritual views, find the psychological stuff more compelling, or remain pretty skeptical.
Well, hopefully this deep dive has given you some valuable nuggets, maybe sparked some new thoughts.
We definitely encourage you, our listener, to keep exploring these ideas, mull it over, what stands out to you, how does it connect or maybe clash with your own experiences and what you see around you.
It's a rich area for reflection, for sure.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this exploration here at My Mind MashUps.
It's been fascinating to unpack.
If you enjoyed this deep dive and want to hear more discussions like this, please do like, share, and subscribe or follow us. It really helps us out.
Yep. Helps others find the show, too.
You can find My Mind MashUps pretty much everywhere you get your podcasts. Amazon Music, Audible, Facebook, Pocket Casts, Spotify, YouTube. Just search for My Mind MashUps.
We look forward to diving into another topic with you next time.
Thanks for listening.